Hi, welcome to another podcast of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. The Global Network was created in 1992 to work to prevent the arms race from moving into space. You can support the show by clicking on the like button and also subscribing to our YouTube channel. And don't forget to check our website at spaceforpeace.org. Well, we want to thank board member Will Griffin for doing the tech work to make this show possible. And our guest this time is KJ No, who's from the West Coast of the United States. He's Korean born and was in the Korean Army and is a member of Veterans for Peace. He's an academic and a writer and much, much more. So welcome to the show, KJ.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Take a minute and just briefly introduce yourself a bit more, please.
Yeah, it's as you said, I'm a journalist, I'm an educator, I'm a scholar on the geopolitics of Asia. I'm originally from South Korea. I'm currently in the West Coast. I think it's important to say that my family and myself, we lived through four military dictatorships in South Korea. I survived three of them. Actually, some people didn't survive. And, my work is primarily a testament and duty to those who did not. I have been reporting on this escalation to war against China for over a decade. I write for Dissident Voice, Counterpunch Monthly Review, Black Agenda Report. If it's progressive and forward thinking, I have probably written or at least attempted to write for them. I was for over a decade the Asia correspondent for KPFA Flashpoints, and on that show we probably did possibly the most intensive coverage of this escalation to war that I know of in any public media or any public airwaves. So I think I know a little bit of what I'm talking about. And to be honest, I've been something of a Cassandra warning against this escalation for the past 10 years. So every year, the nightmare just gets a little bit closer. We edge closer to the brink of the precipice.
Well, then let's talk about war with China. Is it a real possibility? And if so, why?
Yeah, it doesn't please me to say this, but I think the possibility is very, very real. Everything points to imminent preparation for war, imminent possibility of war. And the reason why I say that is that we can see that the doctrine is in place, the appropriations are in place, the alliances are in place, the preparations, logistics, exercises are in place, and the pre-kinetic dimensions of war. If you think of war as a continuum, the pre-kinetic, the pre-shooting dimensions of war are already happening. And we can also see other signals as well. So I would say it's not an exaggeration to say the war has already started. And it's not a Cold War the way that the Cold War was. People say it's a Cold War, but remember the Cold War was searing hot in many places. And I would say that it's no longer a Cold War in a very real sense. It's already started. So let me just talk about doctrine. The U.S. has been preparing this war explicitly since 2009, right after the end of the 2008 global crash. A doctrine called air-sea battle was prepared. And the US adopted this in the Quadrennial Defense Review in 2008. And this is a formal doctrine of war against China. It's titled Air Sea Battle, which is actually a reference to the doctrine of war against the Soviet Union, which was called Air Land Battle. Air Land Battle is, deep synchronized, agile, and offensive warfare against the Soviet Union, and also in the Middle East. It was used in the Gulf Wars 1 and 2. And air sea battle is the military counterpart of that for China, Why was it started in 2008? Essentially, the US had an engagement with China, but this engagement was to exploit China until it collapsed, because there was a large party of the ruling class that believed that China would collapse, or that they would be able to corrupt it into this kind of crony capitalism like the Soviet Union. Neither of those things happened. China developed on its own terms, and it also showed that development does not mean westernization. It doesn't mean subjugation to the West, and it doesn't mean having to become capitalist. And when that became clear, in particular after 2008, the financial crash, that's when the daggers came out and this doctrine of war was prepared. I also mentioned logistics and exercises. Now, those of us who have been in the military know that war is logistics. And when logistics shifts or upshifts, you know that there are real preparations for it. We can already see this happening. We see this in the type and the tenor and the intensity of military exercises against China. We see the shift from counterinsurgency to air sea battle and the third and fourth offset. General Minihan, this is the Minihan memo, said that expect war by 2025. And once again, when the logistics people speak, you listen to them. There's also another window, people say 2027, but whatever it is, it's not a matter of if, but when. And currently, right now, every single day of the week, nonstop throughout the year, there are intensive joint force training exercises preparing for war against China everywhere in the Pacific. It's nonstop. We can also note that there is a wall of missiles prepared for China all along the first island chain. We already know there are 330 to 400 bases. There are 375,000 US troops. 60% of US naval capacity is already rotated into the Pacific. They're training for specific war doctrine against China: diffuse, disperse, distributed warfare, island warfare, scoot and shoot, standoff maneuvers, subsurface, automated. All of that is already happening.
Let me
And
ask.
then the piece.
Let me ask you
Mhm.
briefly why you think the United States and even NATO now they're even pulling NATO into this. Why are they so eager to go to war with China?
That is the $64,000 question. Essentially, as I said, the engagement with China was a collapsist doctrine. It was this idea, it was a regime change, it was a soft regime change doctrine. They believed that China would be able to be pulled into the fold and put into its corner, subjugated. It was not supposed to arise on its own terms. Starting 1991, the US had this doctrine where it believed that it was supposed to have total control of the planet, what they refer to as unipolar global hegemony, full spectrum dominance, that there was, that the 21st century was the American century, and that everything and everyone should subjugate itself to the US, which was going to be at the apex of the pyramid, that it was going to be the boss of the world. At the same time, even early as back as 1991, they noticed the glimmer that China could become a contender or a challenger to the United States. And therefore, plans to contain China were already built into the Defense Planning Guidance document and in the 1997 Project for a New American Century, Rebuilding America's Defenses document. All of that was kind of prepared ideologically. And then there was a diversion against, towards counterinsurgency and to the Middle East because of 9/11, which had its own agenda. But all of this has to do with the idea that the US has to remain the supreme power of the planet. It cannot brook or challenge, cannot tolerate any challenges. And therefore, China has to be taken down, in particular because it controls or has a large part of the Eurasian continent, which geostrategic thinkers have always seen as critical to control over the planet. He who controls the world island controls the world. they have to make sure that China does not control the Eurasian mass. Otherwise, U.S. Hegemony will become an afterthought.
So Taiwan appears, just as Ukraine today, as the flashpoint, the proxy for war with Russia. We've now seen that coming for many years. It appears that Taiwan would play that same role. Is that correct in your eyes?
Yes, Taiwan plays the role of Ukraine. It's geostrategically lethal because it's at the direct center of the first island chain. You know, the U.S. is building this a wall of missiles. It's sowing dragon's teeth around China, and historically, all sea-based attacks on China have gone through Taiwan, just as all attacks from the West on Russia have gone through Ukraine. So currently, there is a current process of Ukrainizing Taiwan, preparing to transform it into a suicide platform and a proxy for war against China. And so you see, all the weapons. There's even legislation which has been written into the U.S. NDAA, which essentially, and I'm not exaggerating, is a declaration of war against China. But once again, Taiwan is critical because from a historical standpoint, Taiwan is considered part of China. It is a province of China. This is the three communiques. This is the UN Resolution 2375. The world recognizes, 180 countries recognizes, the UN recognizes, the US recognizes, even the Republic of China Constitution recognizes this. And what the US is doing is the US is militarizing Taiwan, turning it into a suicide platform and an outpost or a colony of US imperialism to prepare for war against China. China cannot tolerate this. Just to give you an analogy, it's as if like a family member, Taiwan, locked themselves in the garage. Okay, that's fine. They lock themselves in the garage. You can tolerate that for a moment, and you make sure they get fed and et cetera, et cetera. But if that family member starts to stockpiling weapons and dynamite and gasoline, how long before you have to try and disarm them? And essentially, that is what is happening right now. The US is encouraging secession, which is intolerable for any sovereign state. They're turning Taiwan into a danger to self and others. All the triggers are set, the fuses have been prepared. And the U.S. has this, legislative plan. It originally called the Taiwan Policy Act, now called TERRA, and it's a legislative plan for war. It's a micromanaging both of their military and their government, and it has to do with packing them full of weapons to prepare for them to turn into a new Ukraine. It's extraordinary. And this is the reason why this is going to be one of the key triggers.
Well, Japan is a key U.S. ally in this whole thing. Their military budget in 2024 is going to reach $53 billion, 12% increase over the previous year. They're buying 15 F-35 warplanes, various precision-guided missiles, and ships in order to improve their troop and equipment movement. And then they're also constructing two of their own Aegis destroyers and a new class of frigates to begin operations in the region. So Japan exists really as a country that's been politically captured by the US. And then also there's Korea. Would you talk about Korea, where Korea fits into this as sort of another US client state that will be aimed at China?
Yes, both Korea and Japan are captured client states. They're US vassals, and they will be the most important attack dogs against China. Korea, because it has one of the world's largest military manpower forces, 3.7 million troops, 600,000 regular, 3.1 million reserve troops. And all of these troops fall under US operational control the moment the US decides that it wants to use them. All of these troops, all of their material, all of their bases essentially becomes US war material, US force the moment the US decides that it wants it. All it has to do is declare DEFCON 3, Okay, so that creates an incredible moral hazard because you have endless cannon fodder in the form of highly trained Korean troops. South Korea clearly is not sovereign. It simply does whatever the U.S. tells it to do, and every war that the U.S. has been, South Korea has been right there. The most significant being the Vietnam War, where there's 320,000 Korean troops, and after 1972, it was essentially a Korean War fighting against Vietnam. The Korean troops outnumbered U.S. troops, and so Korea is critical. And then Japan is also critical, as you pointed out. The budget increases, the remilitarization, but also Japan will have the world's third largest military budget. It's currently the fifth most powerful military. It'll probably become the fourth most powerful military after these budget increases. And once again, Japan is a complete and totally captured state. The island of Okinawa is essentially overrun with U.S. bases, 50,000 troops in Japan alone. The ruling party, the LDP, was created by the CIA, and since 1955 they have held power almost continuously. Now, the LDP and the Japanese ruling militaristic elite have wanted to remilitarize since the end of the war. This time they get their way. And once again, let's remember Japan's World War II violence. The Nazis told the Japanese to rein in their atrocities because they were so shocked. They made the Nazis look like Boy Scouts. 35 million Chinese killed, industrial slavery in Manchukuo, 400,000 sex slaves, Unit 731, medical experimentation on humans. They colonized almost every corner of Asia, including large chunks of China, and the kind of human tragedy and catastrophe they wreaked on the continent is beyond imagination. And now the US is remilitarizing Japan because it wants to use it to wage war in Japan, in Korea, and in the East China Sea, along Taiwan and the South China Sea. And so, once again, they're strewing the Japanese archipelago with missiles, most of which tend to be subsonic, which means that they are first strike missiles, not counter strike missiles. And Japan will provide the standoff forces and the navy. South Korea will provide the military, and this tells us that we are very, very close to war. The preparations are highly advanced.
Let's move to space for a moment, if we could. Space technology now coordinates all warfare on the planet, and it's very clear that the U.S. military is increasing its space operations, creating Space Force in Japan and in Korea, to be aimed at Japan. Can you talk about how you see space technology fitting into this U.S. and NATO and Japan and Korea war against China?
Well, as I said, this war is a war of full spectrum dominance. That is the doctrine, and this is the idea that there are multiple war fighting domains: air, land, sea, but also the space domains become a war fighting domain that the U.S. wants to dominate, and that includes space, outer space, and of course cyberspace, and of course mental space. The idea is the U.S. is going to occupy all of them. Now, in standard militaries always seek the higher ground for battle, and space is the ultimate higher ground. And so the U.S. seeks to dominate space, as you pointed out. They essentially are occupying, parking, totally controlling low Earth orbit, and they currently have a space force set up in Japan. Now they will have a space force set up in Korea. And in the most recent military exercises, Uchi Freedom Shield, the US Space Force participated. And so all of this has to do with the fact that, this space is being occupied in preparation for. Currently, Japan is already cooperating with the United States on satellite launches. It's, sending in payloads. They say it's for GPS, but, it could be for other things. And essentially, low Earth orbit is being saturated with surveillance and potentially weapons. It is, once again, very, very serious.
So is Japan essentially a lapdog like we see in the United Kingdom and Israel? It's a regional military bastion that the U.S. controls, and is Korea becoming essentially the same thing?
Yes, yes. I mean, Korea has always been a captured state. I mean, it was created as a bridgehead and beachhead against Chinese communism, and it's always served as a bridgehead or a beachhead for war against China. So Korea is completely and totally captured. As I said, its military is completely captured. It's the U.S. has OPCON over South Korean military. South Korea's military has existed since 1948, but during that period, up to the current moment, South Korea has had sovereignty over its own military for only 13 months, almost 78 years, and only a little bit over a year has it actually had actual control over its own military. The U.S. says we only have wartime operational control, but that's a that's a mischaracterization because militaries are built for war. And so if you control a military during wartime, it's your military. It's like saying, I own the car when it's on the street. Yes, when you drive, it's your car, then it's your car. It doesn't matter, who it belongs to when you're parking it in the garage for maintenance. That's not the issue. So South Korea is clearly a captured state. Japan is clearly a captured state. And the other piece is that our minds have been captured. And so coming back to what I said earlier, I said the logistics and exercises show that we're escalating to war. We can see the alliances that are being press ganged into war, primarily Australia, Philippines, and of course JACUS, the Japan Korea alliance. NATO is going to open an office in Japan. The Luftwaffe is sending airplanes to the South China Sea, but also if we look at the pre-kinetic dimension of war, as I said, war is a continuum, there's a pre-kinetic dimension. We can see that the information warfare is off the charts. The fear and loathing of China is off the charts. It's a full-on kind of 9/11, post 9/11 type campaign. You can see it in the polls. China is a threat. Everything China is a threat. There's massive threat inflation. Now, China is not doing anything different than it was before, but everything it does now is being depicted as a threat and sometimes as a genocidal level threat. For example, COVID is supposed to be Chinese biowarfare. That puts it in the category of a WMD level threat. It's untrue, but there's enough of this canard circulating that it just kind of seeps into your consciousness. There's this canard that is genociding its own people, absurd, because, for example, the Uyghur population has doubled and their lifespan has increased by 150%. They were exempt from the one-child policy. All of these are lies, but these lies are being constantly catapulted in order to build or create the ground for war. And then the other thing that I'll point out is that we see the attacks on peace groups, People's Forum Tricontinental, Code Pink, etc. And we know that, before war happens, before kinetic war happens, peace and anti-war groups have to be silenced. This is the pattern. Before the infantry launches an attack, you send in the air, you degrade opposition, you prevent any defenses, counter battery, and then you have a no-fly zone, right? Same thing. Before kinetic war is launched, you send in the media, you degrade any opposition, and you impose a no-think zone, and you have narrative dominance, and then you have the kinetic war. And so we can see this, and the early signal of this early feedback is this kind of epidemic of violence against Asians. It's so extensive, it's so extreme. You see everywhere, everyone I know, all the Asians are afraid. They're afraid of being assaulted, attacked, sometimes killed. Murders of Asians are now routine. And it's essentially gets to the point that you cannot have a wholesale campaign of hate mongering without against Asians, without some of that trickling down into retail violence. When you prepare to kill Asians over there, some of that will blow back and end up with Asians over here being killed. This kind of hate mongering, this fear and loathing that is being propagated is one of the clear signals that we are so very close to war.
I recently read a book called The China Mirage, and it was really amazing. It started at the very beginning of U.S. policy that was created by Teddy Roosevelt. And then later on, FDR continued this really evangelistic. It was very much church backed, Methodist Church, Southern Methodist Church money and pastors. And they created national organizations in the United States. They were going to evangelize China, turn it into a U.S. satellite. And of course, they also, in the book, the guy named Bradley that wrote it talked about the opium trade, that people like FDR's grandfather and John Kerry's relatives, generations before, were involved in the opium trade, and that Harvard and Yale and Columbia and Princeton were basically founded on opium money. And they just called it the China trade in those days. And then, in addition, the first intercontinental railroad across the United States was built with this opium money. Can you talk about that long evangelical period of anti-Chinese BS here in the United States as well? Forget
Yes,
about.
you're absolutely correct. That's very, very important historical context. First, let's talk about the Opium War. The East Coast, magnates were built up through essentially drug trafficking into China. That's how they made their money, and they essentially destroyed China as a viable state at the close of the 1945. Something like 25% of the Chinese population was addicted to opium. And that's a story that hasn't been told. The other piece of the story that hasn't been told is the extraordinary efforts that China took in order to rid their country of addiction. Largely, and it's probably the most successful public health campaign on the planet, was they gave everybody land. Land reform was the basis, along with kind of collective action and collective meaning making and collective work, which is what allowed China to crawl itself out of that extraordinary, kind of toxic imperial addiction that was forced on it. But you're absolutely correct. This is how the East Coast families became rich. This is how the Ivy Leagues became, important, because they all had this money. And so the US already has an incredible debt to China in terms of the violence that it wreaked on China through this opium trade. Historians have referred it to as one of the worst crimes in human history, one of the longest lasting and of the most atrocious crimes perpetrated in human history, certainly of the 19th and 20th centuries. I think we can definitely, it's way up there. But this evangelical trend is also very, very important, because essentially the idea or the conceit was that they were going to turn China into a Christian nation, that they were going to take this heathen and turn them into a Christian nation. And they allied with the KMT, the Kuomintang. This was the losing fascist party that lost to the communists. But the US sank all its chips into the KMT, because the KMT, sold the promise to the US that they would help the US turn China into a civilized Christian nation. And
You're talking about Chiang Kai-shek, the leader.
Chiang Kai-shek, yes, and his wife in particular.
Yeah.
Yes. So the US had this notion that, that it was essentially going to dominate the world. This is the white Western exceptionalism, but in particular, China was going to be turned into, reformed into a Christian nation, that it was going to be civilized. And, this kind of, arrogance, but also this madness infects us to the current moment. And just, example, Simi Valley is where all the, hawks and the Republicans and the right wing talk to themselves. And most recently, I think last year, they were, the head of CSIS, which is one of the Warhawk think tanks, along with CNAS, was quoting Reinhold Niebuhr. And now, those of you who know Reinhold Niebuhr, he was the theologian, very important. He was one of the architects of the Cold War. George Kennan created the strategic architecture and doctrine, but Reinhold Niebuhr created the moral architecture. And that moral architecture can be summarized in one phrase, which is better dead than red. In other words, Reinhold Niebuhr is on the record saying to Mike Wallace, it's morally justifiable to risk the end of the planet to prevent communism. US capitalism must dominate the world. Better the end of the world than the end of US dominance. And in that, you can see this kind of missionary, evangelical doctrine traced all the way back, to the early engagement with China, which continues down to this day, down to this moment. And I would argue that this kind of religious thinking is a kind of certifiable madness. That is to say, they want to wage war against Russia, they want to wage war against China, and they don't care if it ends in the end of the planet.
Well, we're down to about 2 minutes, but we must. I must ask you this final question. What do we do? Those of us that are anti-war people, that see through this United States uh, entitlement, imperialism, empire. What do we do to deal with this on a practical political level in our country?
Well, I think the first thing is you can't let yourself be infected by this madness, this exceptionalism, this idea that war against China or even against Russia is even conceivable. I mean, war itself is inconceivable and, immoral and unthinkable. But, war between superpowers is complete and total madness. And I think the first thing to understand is that your mind is a battle space. As I said, space is a domain of war, and your mind itself is a battle space. So don't let yourself become occupied territory for war. Don't be a collaborator with the war machine. If you're watching Amy Goodman, and you find yourself parroting mainstream media tropes, you have already been colonized, captured, indoctrinated. So don't let your heart be captured. Think for yourself, think critically, watch out for manipulation. I read Caitlin Johnston because I find her very helpful. I think others might too. And then it's important to ally with those who oppose this war. You have to act together and support Code Pink, No Cold War, Tricontinental, Dongsheng News, of course, Space for Peace, Veterans for Peace, but ally and work together. And also don't fund the war machine. When I speak of the war machine, I'm talking about the New York Times, Washington Post, cancel all those subscriptions. Don't donate to Democracy Now! Don't give them your money. Don't pay to be propagandized. They're getting a lot of money from the government to do that already. You don't have to pay for the bullets that are going to silence you. And expect to be silenced, but still speak out. Take action, speak out, share the truth, call out the lies. Remember, in war, the first casualty is truth. So call out the propagandists, those who are telling lies, those who are telling half truths, call them all out and speak up, speak out, take action, collaborate. Not doing so will cause us moral injury. But worse than that, we could see the end of the world. The US cannot win a war against China, it can only destroy the planet. It certainly cannot win war against two superpowers. That war has to go nuclear. In fact, nuclear doctrine is written into air land battle and air sea battle. And so, right now, we're at a very critical state. We have to do everything humanly possible. We have to fight back, take action, speak out, collaborate, and really, throw our bodies on the line against this war machine.
Thank you. Thank you very much, KJ. Brilliant, brilliant interview. Appreciate it very much. And thanks
Thank
for
you.
watching another edition of Space Alert. We'll do another show soon with another leader in the movements up from a different part of the world. Until then, good luck to you all, and please get organized.